what I'll give you then. But Luke chapter 16, verse 25. I read this last night, but it just something kind of stuck out in my mind here. And it says, "But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented." And I don't know, when I read that last night, and I read that today, when it says, "But Abraham said, Son, remember." And I preached on hell last night, and it seemed like when I get started on something, I can't hardly get off of it. And they say that it's not popular to preach on hell. I've read that. They say if you want to have a crowd, don't preach on hell. So obviously that's right. We're down about 30 tonight, so I don't know if that's true or just coincidence. But still, yet we still need to be preaching on hell. We need to be preaching on judgment. We need to be preaching on, like Brother Johnny was talking about. It's gonna mean a lot. You know, I've only been coming. This makes 10 years. Last night, I believe, was 10 years to the day when I first came to this church, and they preached that then. They preached that it's going to mean everything to make it to God's good heaven, and I believe that. The righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? And if it's going to mean everything. But when I read that, and I read about all the things that will accompany hell, and you know, the modern world has said, well, there's no such place. There is a place called hell. Jesus preached 9 times to 1 more on hell than he did heaven. I believe in a heaven. I believe in a hell. I believe the Word of God is very clear about that place called hell. And when I read about it, and I read all that entails that, whenever you read about the fire that is never quenched and the worm that never dies, and you read about the weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, when you read all that, it's a scary thing, you know. I mean, really, if you ever sit and just ponder on hell, that is a very terrifying thing to know that the vast majority of the people are going to go to hell. But the thing that I don't know, it seemed like when I read that really scared me the most is when he said, Son, remember. Because to me, that's going to be one of the most agonizing things in hell is that you have a memory. That you'll remember the opportunities, the missed opportunities that you had. You'll remember the altar calls. You'll remember the conviction. You'll remember the preaching. You'll remember the singing. You'll remember the testimonies. You'll remember every time that you had an opportunity to make things right. And you'll remember when you pushed that away. And to me, that is a terrifying thing, to be able to remember. And you know, I don't know, I was thinking today about all the people that's went on. You know, I've heard some stories, great stories about people in this church, you know, that maybe had the gift of healing. And you hear about those ones that's preached the gospel and the ones that's kept this going. And I'm proud of this church. This church has been here for a long, long time, and I believe it'll keep right on going as long as we stay in the Word. And all these that I've heard about, maybe that I didn't know them. You know, you hear a lot of people that, you know, like Burnell, he's been to church for 50-some years, and he's went to church with a lot of good saints of God. And he can tell you the testimony they had. But one of these days, I'm going to get to hear that testimony. One of these days, when we get to heaven, there's going to be time where where there'll be no end to time. Through the eons, we can sit and we can listen to everybody's testimony, and we can relay that over and over, and we'll get to sit and hear the great testimonies of saints of God that have went on, those that held up the banner, those that carried the gospel message, and we'll get to hear their testimony. That's going to be amazing. I can't wait till one day when I get to heaven to get to sit down and listen to Paul tell his testimony about being on the Damascus Road one day and God knocking him down and a light shining from heaven. I'll get to hear that firsthand, and you will too if you make it there. You get to hear firsthand how Peter, one day when they was out getting ready to go fishing, they was cleaning their nets out, and the Son of God walks by and says, follow me and I'll make you to become fishers of men. And you'll get to hear their testimony. You get to hear the testimony when Peter would talk about, or when they would write that Peter would passing by, the shadow of him passing by would heal the sick. But one day I'll get to hear that from his own lips. And I thought today, you know, all those Bible characters that we hear about, we get to hear that firsthand. Get to sit down with blind Bartimaeus and hear how one day he was sitting there and he heard that Jesus came by. And he began to cry with a loud voice, and everybody began to tell him, hold your peace. But the Bible says, but he cried all the louder, Jesus, thou Son of David, have mercy on me. And the Son of God stopped and called him to him and healed his blinded eyes. We'll get to hear that. Get to hear about the woman at the well and get to hear firsthand her story. Remember, she goes into the city and says, come and meet a man who told me all things ever I did. Is not this the Christ? Her testimony brought a whole city out to see the Lord. And by doing that, a bunch of those people got saved because of her testimony. But someday in heaven we'll get to hear that testimony. Get to hear about one day when she came to get water, and she'd lived with 5 men. She'd had 5 husbands. The man she was with now was not her husband, but she looks around, and a Jewish rabbi is sitting there and begins to tell her, "Give me to drink." And she says, "You asked me, a Samaritan?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "But if you knew the gift of God and who it was that asked you, you would have asked me, and I would have given you living water." And you hear about all these. You hear about, I think one day we'll get to see that woman that was caught in the very act of adultery and drug out in front of Jesus, and they said, "Now, here she is. We've caught her in the very act, and Moses' law said stone her. But what do you say about that?" And to look in the eyes of that woman that is sitting there, and she has a death sentence passed on her. There's no getting out of it. There's no getting out of what she done. She was caught in the very act. Moses' law said to pick up stones and stone her to death. And to be stoned to death is a horrible, horrible fate. I mean, we think about people being stoned. We don't think much about that. But you imagine being beat to death with big rocks the size of your fist, and your skull and your bones be broken by people waylaying you with rocks? And her whole eternity was based upon what that man said. Because if that man says do it, she's a dead woman. And if all Jesus had to say was to say stone her, and that woman right now for 2,000 years would have been burning in a lake of fire. All it took was just those words, do it. But instead he looks into the eyes of those men, and he said, which one of you is without sin, let him cast the first stone. And they began to throw their stones down. That woman one day, I believe she'll be in heaven, and I'll get to hear that story because her eternity was based upon that. And that'd be wonderful. I mean, you could go on. The whole Bible is full of these characters that we could talk about. These people who were saved by grace. These people who have a wonderful, wonderful testimony. And that's going to be one of the splendors of heaven, is to get to hear those testimonies. The Bible says, and they overcame Satan by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And a testimony is a wonderful thing. And when it's anointed, when there is an anointed testimony in the church house, it will equal the preaching. There's no preaching that could top a good testimony. And we need a testimony. Every one of us needs a testimony of what God has done for us. That's the testimony. Testimony is not what you've done, because you didn't do anything. You was lost and undone. You was unfit and unable to save yourself, and He done something for you. And that's what we'll hear throughout the course of eternity. We'll hear about what Jesus Christ done for everybody that we talk to. But I also thought about that. That's in heaven. But what about if you go to hell? I'm going to use a liberty here tonight, and someone might argue and say, well, there's not going to be such thing as a testimony service in hell, and that's probably true. But I thought a lot about that today, and I'm telling you, when I thought about it, I'd feel the chills run all over me to think about that. And I wonder, in the middle of that place called hell, in the middle of outer darkness, in the middle of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, in the middle of that fire that is never quenched, and that worm that never dies, and that agony of hell, I wonder if every now and then there'll be a voice rise up above the screams of the damned and will begin to give their testimony. Because the Bible says that He said, "Son, remember." And I wonder if somewhere in hell that the voice of that rich man will rise up and say, "I had the opportunity. I had the chance. There was a poor man named Lazarus that laid out there, and all I had to do was go out and to bring him into my house. Go out and offer him something. Go out and try to help him. All I had to do, I had the opportunity day after day after day, and I could have helped that man. But instead I didn't." And the agony of the remembrance of it, that's what Abraham said. He said, "Son, remember." Because in hell you will have a memory of these services. You'll have a memory of the life you could have lived. And there'll be no excuse. Stand at the judgment seat one day. You'll never be able to say, well, somebody did this to me or somebody done that. It won't matter what anybody did, because your life will be laid out in panoramic view of every opportunity. And the Son of God will say right here is when I sent conviction to you. This is when the Holy Ghost moved in the church service and you had the chance. This is when you could have made things right with God. This time after time after time. And we preach that you are obligated to have, God is obligated to give you one opportunity. There's not a person in this church house that has only had one opportunity. Because you have had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. Time after time, day after day, the Spirit of God has dealt with you. And one day in hell, that will be the most agonizing thing of it all, is to see how easy you could have been saved. How easy you could have stepped out and made your way to an altar prayer. How easy you could have bowed your knees. How easy you could have prayed. How easy you could have called out upon Jesus Christ to save your soul. And how easy it would have been. The biggest offense in hell will be the cross of Christ. That a man came and paid for your penalty and paid your sin and became the propitiation for your sin and took on the wrath of God for himself. And all you had to do was go to him. And everything would have been fine. But instead, I believe somewhere in the middle of hell, you'll have the rich man that will cry out and say how easy it would have been, how I could have done that. You know, we sang the song that in heaven we're going to get to sing a new song. We've been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Leonard Ravenhill said in hell, the song in hell must be Jeremiah 8:20. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and yet we're not saved. And we're getting given the opportunity, and people don't take it. You know, there's no point in preaching bubblegum messages when people are going to hell. There are people sitting in this church house that's going to go to hell. You hear what I got to say? We can look around and say, well, that ain't never repented. I'm going to tell you, it's much more than just somebody that's never walked down to an aisle or walked down an aisle to an altar. There's people that'll sit in here that claim to be Christians that one day will face the wrath of hell. Is that right? It's a very dangerous thing, and it's a scary thing. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But it's a quiet church service tonight. But this is I wonder if somewhere in the middle of hell, if ever there'll be a testimony service. And the rich man will say, but I could have done things right, but I didn't do it. And I wonder if his voice will ever trail off in the distance. And another voice will speak out, and it'll be Pilate. And Pilate will stand and say, you know, I had the opportunity. One day they brought in a Jewish rabbi to stand before me. And while I stood there and talked to him, I looked into the eyes of that man and I asked him, what is truth? And was looking point blank into truth incarnate and asked the silly question, what is truth? That's what a lot of people do. They're searching for truth, and they're searching for answers, and they're searching for happiness. And they come to church and they hear the message, the devil says, that's not it. Something else will bring you happiness. Something else will bring you joy. Something else will bring you fulfillment. Only to find a lifetime of wasting your time like a dog chasing its tail after things that don't amount to a hill of beans. The only thing that even matters is your name written down in the Lamb's Book of Life. That is truth. That is the truth. That is exactly what everybody is looking for. And I wonder if Pilate will say, that man stood there that day, and I asked the question, what is truth? And I was going to let him go. And all the Jewish leaders outside kept on crying out, crucify him, crucify him. And I washed my hands of the blood of that innocent man and said, there, see, you took, but I've never been able to get that blood off my hands. And I wonder if he ever would say, you know, one day while I was standing there talking to him, I looked into his eyes and I told him, I said, do you not realize that I have power to let you go? And I have the power to crucify you. And that man looked me right in the eye. That Jesus of Nazareth looked me right in the eye and said, you would have no power at all except it were given to you from above. And I let the one opportunity that I had, I let that man walk away condemned because of my cowardice. I let that man walk off. And I could never get him out of my mind. That I went on afterwards, and later on, Pilate would be demoted, and he would be sent to another place, and he would lose his governorship. And I wonder if Pilate in the middle of hell will say, I let the only opportunity I had walk away from me. And nothing would bring me happiness, and I could never get rid of that man's face before me. But the problem is that Pilate died. And Pilate, who said, I have power to let you go or power to crucify you. Then I wonder if Pilate would say, I stood there then at the judgment seat. And I looked into the eyes of that same man. And that man that I told him that I have power now looked at me and said, do you realize I have power now? Now the roles have changed. Now Jesus is the one that sits in authority, and he's the one that sits there as a condemned man. And Jesus said, I'm the one that has the power to let you go, and I'm the one that has power to let you go into everlasting darkness. I wonder if as his voice trails off, there are a million voices that could cry out, every one the same. They had the opportunity, and that's the same thing. If you ever have to face hell, it'll be the same thing for you, that you had the opportunity. Time after time. It's quiet tonight. Wonder if the rich man, the rich young ruler who came to Jesus, wonder if somewhere in hell his voice will cry out. And he said, I went to him one day. I went to that man named Jesus. And I wanted to be justified. I wanted him to tell me what a good boy I was. See, that's what a lot of people do. They want to be told how good they are. They want a pat on the back and say, oh, bless you, brother. But listen to me, it's going to mean more than bless you, brother. And it's going to mean more than somebody raised their hand in a church service to make it to God's good heaven. It's going to take a life. That rich young ruler say, I came to him one day and I wanted him to brag on me. I wanted him to tell me everything was all right. And I asked him, what must I do to have eternal life? And that man looked at me and said, then just keep the commandments. And he said, I told him, all these have I kept from my youth up. But then that man looked at me and said, if you want to be perfect then, and if you're going to have everlasting life, then go and sell everything you've got. And come and follow after me, and you'll have stuff laid up in heaven. I wonder if that rich man said, I didn't like that answer. And I walked away. And I walked away from the opportunity that I had. And right now, that rich man that's been burning in hell for 2,000 years could have been dancing around the throne of God, could have been walking down streets of gold right now, could have had a mansion laid up in heaven. But I wonder if he ever says, I let the opportunity pass me. It will be the same thing throughout eternity, all these missed opportunities. Because that is exactly what we are given. We are given the opportunity, night after night, weekend after weekend. Given an opportunity for people to make things right with God. We preach the seriousness of this, and we preach more than, like Johnny said, moral obligations. We preach that it's going to mean everything to make it there. And I wonder if that rich young ruler, as his voice trails off, if one of the 70 that walked away from Jesus would cry out, I should be the most ashamed. Because I walked with that man for years. I sat at his feet. That man taught me. I heard the Sermon on the Mount. I watched him open the blinded eyes. I saw him heal the sick. I saw him raise the dead. I listened to the words of life come forth from that man. And one day he said something that I didn't like, and I got offended at it, and I walked away. That is what so many people are doing, is they're getting offended because the Word of God doesn't line up with their schedule and don't line up with their theology, and they get mad and want to leave. There's a billion people in hell that didn't like what they've got, what men of God had to say. And that man said, I was one of the disciples that walked away. And I should be most ashamed because I had the opportunity more than anybody. And his voice trails off. There in the chasm of hell and the screams of the damned, that dark dungeon, that doomed humanity, you hear another voice rise up of Judas Iscariot and said, but I of all people, because I walked with him longer than all of you. And I saw more miracles, and he even let me carry the money bag. And I walked with that man, and I saw things that would blow your mind. And I looked, I never saw him ever get mad. I never saw him once sin. I never saw him do anything. And yet, one day, over a little bit of 30 pieces of silver, I sold my Lord. And now I've been burning in hell. I went out and hanged myself. I felt so guilty about it that I hanged myself. And they tell me my bowels gushed out on the ground. But been tormented for 1900 years now because of what I done. You say, oh, what a terrible thing that Judas would sell his Lord for 30 pieces of silver. There's a lot of people that sold him for a lot less than that. They've sold him for a whole lot less than 30 pieces of silver. They sold him for nothing. Esau sold his birthright for a little bit of porridge, and there've been a lot of so-called Christians that sold him for a whole lot less. There's a whole lot of people in hell whose eyes for the first time are being opened, and they realize that the devil blinded them. The Bible said, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them, lest they should see the light of the glorious gospel. You could go right on down through it. You could see all these. What about the other thief on the cross? We talk about the one that Jesus said from this day on. But I wonder if the other thief on the cross, wonder if somewhere his voice don't rise up above all the screams and says, you know, I sat there in my last moments of life. I sat there literally on my deathbed. I was dying. I was hanging there as a condemned man. And I looked and I saw there was something different about that man. But even being tortured and even being tormented, even as I was being executed, my stinking pride was too great to actually ask him for help. You go to hell, and that's exactly why you went to hell, because of your own stinking pride. Why would a man hanging there with a death sentence that's going to die in a matter of hours, that's going to suffocate to death, why would he not cry out to God? For the same reason I've told you time and again, because you don't get saved when you want to get saved. You take the opportunity when it comes, and you don't wait for another chance to come, because that chance may never come again. And I wonder if that man wouldn't say, and my buddy over there, I heard him begin to talk to him and begin to say, when you come into your kingdom, remember me. And I sat there mad, because I was thinking, if you are really who you say you are, then you could get me down from here. And then he died. He died before any of us. That Jesus of Nazareth died before any of us. But I saw him again. This time he wasn't a tortured criminal. But when I think about what he looks like right now, I'm telling you, buddy, it gives me chills to think about how John described Jesus. He's not packing a little lamb. He's not a little shepherd. He's not walking around beat down by the world. He's not hanging his head because he can't make eye contact with anybody. John said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a voice like a trumpet, and being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks, and in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man. His head and his hair was white like wool. His eyes was a flame of fire. Out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword. His voice was as a sound of many waters. Girt about the path with a golden girdle. His feet burned like fine brass as they burned in a furnace. And the Bible said, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in its strength. And that thief said, you know, last time I saw him, he was hanging there a broken man. The next time I saw him, he had all power given to him in heaven and in earth. And because of my ignorance, I am in hell today, because I wouldn't ask him to help me. All I had to say was, all right, when you come into your kingdom, remember me too. Right? So many people, so many things could be said. Felix. I wonder if the voice of Felix will ever cry out. Felix say one day there was a little man, they brought him in. This little, short, less than 5 foot tall Jewish man. He had a beard and he bow-legged, bald head, walked in there. He was a prisoner, and he stunk of the prison. And we marched him in front of us to mock him, and when he marches in, he stands there before us. But something was different about that little man, and he began to preach to us. And he took the opportunity. We wanted him to defend himself, and he didn't do it. But instead, he began to say, you know, one day on the road to Damascus, I met somebody. And as he began to preach, his voice changes, and he begins to tell them. The Bible said, and he reasoned with them of righteousness and temperance and judgment to come. Felix said, something happened to me that day. Something was different. I'd never heard a man talk like that before. And Felix would say, and I began to feel conviction. My knees began to tremble. There was something about that. There was something rising up in me, shaking, and I knew what he was saying had to be true. And I began to look around and think at all that I had and all that I'd have to give up if I were to follow after this little man and this man that named Jesus that he preached about. And I stood and told him, and I said, when it's convenient, I'll call for you again. Only for Felix to say, but that season never came. I died never having an opportunity again, pushing that away. And his voice dies down. And another voice rises up of King Agrippa. King Agrippa said, I was there, and I was the king, and I sat on a throne. And one day they told me about this man that had appealed to Caesar, and I called for him to come in. And the Bible says they came in with great pomp. And here they march him in. They blow the trumpets that the king is on the throne. And they've laid down the best robe. And they put the best robe over his shoulders. They put a scepter in his hand and a crown on his head. And he said, as everything was fixed, and they marched that little man in. And he began to preach to me. And as he preached, I had my buddy Festus sitting over beside me. And I never heard a man preach like that man preached. And conviction was gripping my heart, and I knew that what he was saying was right, and I felt the urge to pray. I wanted to get down off my throne right where I was at and get down and pray and cry out to this Jesus that he was preaching about. And I heard a voice beside me of Festus that said, Paul, much learning's made you mad. You're crazy, Paul. And I didn't want to embarrass myself. I didn't want for Festus to think less of me. And I sat there and I laughed it off. And I told Paul, you almost persuaded me to be a Christian. And everybody laughed when I said it, but I meant what I said. Because I was this close to praying. This close to going down and getting on my knees and crying out. I was that close. And because I was afraid of what somebody else thought about me. Knocked me out of being saved and being in heaven right now. So instead, I've been burning in a place of torment for the last 1900 years. Again, it's just speculation. But you know, it's exactly, when we read through these stories, it's exactly what people are doing. People, because of their pride, they won't come and they won't bow their knees. They think they've got all the time in the world, like Felix. They think when it's convenient. When it's a convenient season, but yet millions of people are. We can say, well, you can leave here and may never come back. You might come back and you might not. But if you do, you'd have no guarantee that conviction will be there. I'm seeing an urgency in this, and I don't mean to keep just bearing down on this, but there is a literal place called hell. Break it all down and let's get to the root of it all. When you die, and you are going to die, you don't know that day. You may not live another day, and you may live 50 years. You don't know that. But the guarantee is that you are going to have to face the judgment seat. You are going to have to stand before a holy God. Every knee is going to bow and every tongue is going to confess, and we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and we shall all give an account to the things done in this body, whether good or whether bad. John said it in the book of Revelation. He talked about a great white throne. And he said, and I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. I saw the rich and the poor. I saw the great men and the men that was beggars. I saw the high and the low of it all. Just because you're rich doesn't make you saved, but neither does by being poor make you saved. Just because you're a poor person, that doesn't make you saved either. The only people that are saved is those that have had a born-again experience, that the blood of Christ has been applied to your life. There's not many paths to heaven. There's still only one way. I don't care if it's righteous Abel to the last person that's saved before the tribulation. It'll still be the same way. You have to go by Jesus Christ. Is that all right? And this is a reality, and this is a serious thing. And I thought, we hear all of them, and we see this. And the reason Agrippa didn't pray that day, I truly believe that, is because he didn't want Festus to think less of him. He had a friend sitting there, and he wouldn't He wouldn't bow his knees because his friend had said, much learning's made you mad, Paul. Do you realize how many people are in hell tonight because their friend was there, or their husband or wife was there, and they didn't want to embarrass themselves in front of their friends? I know that to be true. They've been enough conviction preached in this church house to save the world. And the kids sit back here and, hey, it's my job now. Kids sit back here, mine's right in amongst them, sit back there and laugh and try to push that off and don't even know if they're even hearing a thing that's being said. You got a bunch of saved people that we're preaching to, and we got teenagers that's going to hell in this church house, and we don't say anything about it. We don't want to offend anybody. God, I hope mine is never one of those voices that cries from the pits of hell. I hope to God that it ain't mine. I hope to God it ain't yours. I hope it ain't the young people of this church that'll stand and point. More than that, they can't stand and point their finger in my face and say, you didn't tell me. I've told you week after week, year after year, I've told you, and you sit there and let it go in one ear and out the other and busy your mind so you don't have to listen to the preaching. And instead going to go to hell because they don't want to hear the message. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church. Like I said, I don't know, and I don't mean to embarrass JC, but I'd rather be embarrassed than go to hell. I've been worried about her. Bad worried about her here lately. One of the greatest words I ever heard in my life. Jonda was pregnant with JC. We didn't know if she was a boy or a girl. Didn't know. And that day when we went down, we already had a boy's name picked out and had a girl's name picked out too. We already had a boy's name picked out too. Honestly thought it was a boy. And John had a C-section done, so you don't see your child born when they do that. So we're sitting behind a white sheet. And when we're sitting behind that, I'll never forget, as long as I live, that doctor looking up at me and said, you got a girl. One of the greatest things that ever happened in my life, by far. And I remember packing her out. I remember that, packing her out. Johnny out there, they even got pictures of it. That was Johnny's first grandchild, and he just about run to me. I mean, he was a hug. And that's before I was saved, too, so I wasn't much of a hugger, but I got hugged plenty that day. But I'll never forget that as long as I live. And I've tried to provide, and I've tried to give her everything that she's wanted. And in fact, probably to a fault, because I probably spoiled her. Johnny has too, Johnny and Becky, we've all spoiled her to death. And I thought about that today, and I started crying thinking about it. That as much as that means to me, my daughter, if one day she leaves here and has to be one of those voices crying from hell, I would rather she'd never been born than to leave this world without Jesus Christ in her life. As much as I love her and as much as I'm proud of her, I would rather that she'd never been born than to have to face that place called hell. That my brother, that I spend more time with him than anybody else. And I told him the other day, I said, I know you better than your own wife knows you. Me and that boy are close. I mean, I can about read his mind. When he starts to say a sentence, I know what he's going to say before he says it. And as close as I am to him, and I love him, man, he don't even know how much I love him. But I'd rather that he had never been born, that I'd never had a brother, than for him to leave this world and go to hell. I would rather, I look across this crowd, and I've got wonderful friends in here, people that I absolutely love. I love you to death. But I'll promise you this, I would rather that you've never been born than to have to face that place called hell. Tired of bubblegum messages and patting everybody and letting on it's going to mean everything to make it to God's good heaven. It's going to take everything to make it there. And if we don't preach hell and we don't preach judgment and we don't preach that it's going to take a born-again experience, we're going to see our families go to hell. Can you imagine a cry from hell from one of your family members? We say pray for them. My Bible says to tell them. It's our job to tell them. It's our job to tell them that judgment is coming. that there is a place coming, there is a day that is coming that you're going to have to face, that you have an appointment. You may have a lot of appointments in this life, a lot of things you can push off, and you can reschedule it. You'll never reschedule that appointment that is coming to you. My Bible says, for it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. And I'd never myself, if concerning me, I would rather, if I leave here and stand before Him one day and He says, depart from me, I don't know you. I would rather to have never drawn my first breath than to have to face that place called hell. While they come to get a song, stand to your feet if you will. But I'm going to tell you something, this is a serious thing. This is a very serious thing, and if we are not very careful, we will miss our day of grace. And we will say, well, I've got time and I've got time. But you don't know that. You have no idea. There is, the sands in your hourglass are going down and you don't know how many's left. You don't know the conviction that comes, and you don't know if it'll ever come again. And like I said, it'd be better if they'd never been born. Philip, I see Philip watching these grandkids and taking care of them. I'd say he'd echo the same thing. It'd be better than they wasn't even born than to have to see one of them go to hell. Be better for your families, your brothers, your sisters, your son. Harold, your son had been better if he'd never been born than have to go to hell. And it's the same thing with all of you. We've all got those people. And it would be better if you'd never even known them. That they'd never been born, that they'd never drawn their first breath. When I thought about that today, I broke down and wept like a baby, thinking it would have been better for me to have never known my daughter than for her to have to go to hell. I don't want to see anybody go to hell. Least of all, anybody in this church house or anybody, any of your families. I do not want to see that. Come on.